It all began innocently, with flirtation, a lighthearted bond between a mother and her son, a slight touch, and a shared gaze. Then came the words that destroyed the moment. "Hurry up, brother. You shouldn't witness this." What ensued was a chain of events that none of us could ever undo. It all began a few weeks ago. The home was unnervingly silent, not the peaceful calm of a relaxed day, but the type of silence that engulfs you and refuses to let go. It seemed heavy, almost real, pushing against the walls and soaking into the air. This home, which had previously been warm and comforting, now seemed cold, remote, and oppressive. I couldn't put my finger on it, but something had changed, and I could feel it with every breath. I was in the kitchen, but I wasn't doing anything. I had an untouched cup of coffee in front of me, yet my hands trembled slightly, as they usually did. When the strain began to rise, I could hear my kid Oliver moving in the next room, with quiet footsteps on the floor. He wasn't talking, and he never did. When the atmosphere was like this, he and I both felt something wasn't right. It was not intended to be like this. This home belongs to our family. Everything was meant to be easy. I'd always been close to Oliver, far closer than I'd imagined. People claim that you cannot have an intimate connection with your children, and that being too close to them is harmful, but they do not know us. They had no idea what it was like to lose my husband so unexpectedly, leaving me to raise Oliver alone. I had to be everything for him: father, mother, guardian, and friend. It wasn't easy, but we persevered for years. It was only the two of us, and I promised myself that I would never let Oliver feel alone. But when my first son, Oliver's elder brother Adam, returned from college, something had changed. Something was wrong, no matter how much I tried to ignore it. I knew. Oliver knew we were both feeling it, the coldness and wrath that flowed from Adam like a thick cloud. He was not the same. He had never been faultless, but this was unique. He was cold, calculating, and sometimes even harsh. The stillness grew longer, until Oliver's voice came through, delicate and seemingly timid, like a whisper in the dark. "Mama." I turned, shocked, to see my kid standing there, his face pallid and his eyes wide. They were clearly worried. Oliver had always worn his heart on his sleeve, making it simple to read, and now his eyes spoke a language I wasn't sure I understood. "Where is Adam?" Oliver's voice was barely audible, as if stating his name aloud gave it substance. I swallowed hard. I didn't want to respond. I did not want to tell the truth, but I couldn't lie either. I murmured upstairs, most likely in his room, as usual. I saw Oliver's shoulders collapse and his eyes drop to the floor. He was afraid. I could see it in the way. His eyes darted anxiously to the stairs, as if he anticipated something bad to happen at any moment. That was absurd. He was 18, yet I was still expected to protect him from things like this, from the anxiety we felt when Adam was there. But how could I protect him if I felt just as lost as he was? I had no clue what had happened to Adam, the son I had reared, who used to laugh and play with Oliver. The person who used to fantasize about his future had transformed into someone colder, darker, and it wasn't simply typical adolescent rebellion. This was something deeper, something I couldn't understand, something deadly. Adam wasn't only angry at the world, he was upset with us. The saddest aspect was that he hadn't only gotten aloof from me. Number Adam had been neglecting Oliver too for a while, first for minor reasons such as brief responses and avoidance of eye contact. But now, Adam didn't seem to care for his younger brother anymore. Like if Oliver were a stranger to him, I couldn't shield Oliver from it. I could not stop him from seeing his brother's cold, disconnected side, which made my stomach twist in knots. I could feel Oliver's gaze on me, waiting for something from me. But what could I say? What could I do? I should have been the strong one, the one who could make things right and reunite the family. But all I felt was a mounting sensation of dread and powerlessness. Mom Oliver's voice cut through my thoughts, a gentle appeal that made my chest constrict. I do not like it. It's as if he isn't actually here anymore, but rather someone else. I closed my eyes and leaned against the counter. The weight of Oliver's comments struck me harder than I anticipated. He was correct. Adam was not the same. He had never been easy to grasp, but this was different. It wasn't simply adolescent angst. It was something deeper. "I understand, sweetheart," I replied, my voice strained. I know I hoped I could say more to make him feel better, and to make myself feel better. But the reality was, I had no idea how to solve it. I didn't know how to help him. That terrified me more than anything. Oliver shuffled on his feet, an uneasy expression crossing his face. What if he does anything, Mom? The words hovered there like a shadow that refused to go away. I wanted to disregard it. Tell Oliver that Adam was simply going through a phase, and that he will soon recover. But I couldn't help but feel the same worry and nagging sensation that something horrible was about to happen. He isn't going to injure anybody, I said, but even as the words escaped my lips, I knew I did not believe them. I was no longer sure what Adam was capable of. Oliver glanced up at me for the first time in a long while. I saw the horror in his eyes, which matched mine. It was the type of terror that no parent should see in his child's eyes. But now we were both locked within this home, with no way out. I'm terrified, Mom, Oliver murmured. The weight of those words almost broke me. I knelt, lowering myself to his level. I grabbed his face in my hands, feeling the warmth of his flesh against my own. The interaction served as a grounding force, reminding me of who I was intended to be, of the commitment I'd made to safeguard him. Oliver, please listen to me, I said gently. You do not need to be terrified. We will work this out. I refuse to allow anything happen to you. You are safe. You are always secure with me. He nodded slowly, but the uncertainty remained in his eyes. The air between us seemed heavy with unsaid words. I did not have the answers. Hell, I didn't even know where to begin. But I couldn't show Oliver my dread. I couldn't show him how lost I felt, how much I was drowning in this scenario. So go to your room, I remarked in a calm but strong voice, and stayed there for a bit. Okay, I will manage everything. Oliver hesitated. I could see the struggle in his eyes, the doubt, the faith he had in me, all competing with the worry that he wasn't secure, that none of us were. I will be all right. I said it, but I wasn't sure I believed it. But Oliver nodded slowly and grudgingly. Okay, Mom, please be cautious. His comments wounded deeper than they should have. I watched him go away, his little form diminishing as he climbed the stairs to his chamber. I wasn't sure how much longer I could keep up this mask, pretending and lying, but I needed to for Oliver's safety. For mine, I returned to the empty kitchen, the quiet, overwhelming. Now that Oliver was gone, I felt something deep within. I felt a familiar gnawing fear. Something was awry, and not just with Adam. It was for all of us, Mom. He started with a quiet voice, as if testing the waters. Do you recall when Dad would watch these movies with us? I hesitated as the knot in my throat thickened, attempting to swallow the words that threatened to rise. Sarah had died years ago, yet the pain still seemed fresh, as if it had occurred yesterday. The area next to me, once filled by her, suddenly seemed vacant. I do, I replied gently, attempting a grin that didn't quite reach my eyes. He adored these vintage flicks, but this is the worst part. The hardest aspect was that I had no clue how things were going to finish. The days started to merge together. What began as a little disruption in our daily routines gradually evolved into something none of us could resist. At first, it was subtle, a longer meal, an additional hour of television, and a quiet game of cards in the evening. But as the days progressed, the tiny moments grew into larger ones. Oliver and I found ourselves seeking one another's company more often than ever before. I'm not sure whether it was because we were both looking for consolation or just attempting to distract ourselves from the mounting anxiety. However, we were closer than we had ever been before. Oliver had always been a sensitive child, and he was close to me, possibly closer than most kids are to their father. It was one of those quiet, unspoken friendships that formed spontaneously over the years of being there for each other after my husband's death. But now, our relationship has taken on a new character. It wasn't simply about comfort anymore. It was something more, something deeper, which I couldn't quite describe. It began one evening when we sat down after dinner, like we normally did, to watch a movie together. I had developed a practice of watching old films that didn't need much thought, just something easy to fill the space. But that night, when I slid onto the sofa, I saw Oliver was sitting closer than usual. I didn't give it much consideration at first. It was not unusual for him to lean on me, but this time seemed different. He was more present. His shoulder touched mine, and when he spoke, his tone was softer, quieter, gentler. He started with a quiet voice, as if testing the waters. "Do you recall when Dad would watch these movies with us?" I hesitated, as the knot in my throat thickened, attempting to swallow the words that threatened to rise. Sarah had died years ago, yet the pain still seemed fresh, as if it had occurred yesterday. The area next to me, once filled by her, suddenly seemed vacant. "I do," I replied gently, attempting a grin that didn't quite reach my eyes. He enjoyed watching old movies, and Oliver nodded but did not move away. He moved in a little closer, his head resting softly on my shoulder. It was such a simple gesture, yet I could feel the weight of it and the change in the air between us. The scene seemed heated with something I couldn't put my finger on. I shuffled awkwardly, wondering how to react. Oliver had not been this close to me physically or emotionally in quite some time. The movie went on, but I could see Oliver wasn't paying attention. He was too preoccupied with something else, his palm softly touching mine as he shifted his position on the sofa. The touch was momentary, yet the feeling lingered. It was almost as if he was looking for something, maybe assurance, or just a means to feel anchored, in the middle of everything that had changed. My chest tightened, and I almost wanted Adam was here to relieve the tension and ruin this precious moment. But then again, I didn't want Adam anywhere near this. Whatever was going on between Oliver and I felt like something. We both needed something. We both desired. It was like an unsaid consolation, a means to fill the void created by all of the things we couldn't express. Oliver's head lay a bit heavier on my shoulder now, and the weight of his presence made my heart hurt. I hadn't realized how much I missed these times, how much I need this calm connection. It was no longer simply about keeping Oliver company. It was about feeling entire again, and discovering something genuine in the middle of all the insanity. "Are you all right, Mom?" Oliver inquired, his voice faint and timid. I tilted my head slightly to look at him, catching his gaze for the first time in what seemed like forever. Something in his eyes, something unsaid, pulled at my heart. I couldn't name it, but there was a shared consciousness between us that none of us had before acknowledged. "I'm okay," I responded, but the words seemed empty even as they left my lips. The fact was, I was not fine. I hadn't been in a long time, but Oliver didn't have to know. He didn't say anything right now, but the way he held my stare said volumes. It was as if we were each waiting for the other to make the next step, giving expression to whatever bizarre feelings were developing between us. However, none of us did. Instead, we sat silently, with the movie's gentle hum filling the space between us. As the evening progressed, we settled into a more comfortable quiet. I couldn't recall the last time I felt this peaceful. This resonated with someone. However, it felt disconcerting, as if we were walking. There was a narrow line between normal and abnormal, something else. The next night, it occurred again. Oliver and I found ourselves seated together at the kitchen table, playing chess. I'd never been very good at chess, but Oliver loved it and had been training me for months. As we sat across from one another, the pieces on the board seemed insignificant compared to the unsay tension that had fallen between us, like a cloud that neither of us could shake. Oliver's fingers brushed against mine as he moved a piece across the board, and I felt the familiar spark of alertness. It was a simple touch that might have been disregarded, but I didn't. None of us did. I glanced up from the board meeting and saw Oliver's eyes, and everything else in the room seemed to slip away. The weight of his stare, the tenderness in his face. It seemed as if he was asking me a question without words, and I wasn't sure how to respond. Mom, Oliver said gently, barely above a whisper, "Do you think things will ever go back to normal?" I stopped, uncertain of how to answer. What was normal anymore? The question weighed heavy and delicate in the air between us. Could things ever be normal again, given Adam's isolation and the rising tension in the house? Could we ever return to the way things were before? I don't know. I spoke honestly, my voice husky with passion. I honestly don't know Oliver. He nodded slowly, as if my response had been what he expected. However, there was anguish in his gaze, a silent desire that made my chest constrict. I wanted to reassure him that everything would be okay, and that we'd get through it together, but I wasn't sure anymore. we resumed our game. I saw that Oliver's motions had become slower and more deliberate. His fingers lingered just a little too long on each piece, and when our hands came into contact again, it was like an electric jolt, both exhilarating and horrifying. I had no idea what was going on, but I couldn't pull away, nor could he. And then was the moment when everything changed. Our lips connected unexpectedly, and we found ourselves kissing one another. The kiss was slow and cautious, and it seemed as if all our troubles had vanished. His hands were on my neck, then moved down to my hips. For a split second, I pulled him away from the moment we both desired. "Are we sure?" I said. "Yes, Mom." "I am," he answered, looking him in the eyes. And after a second, we resumed. It grew considerably heavier, and things only got worse. "Hurry up. Your brothers should not see this," I murmured, trying to hurry. He turned me around and clearly took a second to do his thing, which felt like a huge relief to me. I implored him not to quit, but he didn't listen. He finished pretty quickly, perhaps since it was his first time, but I didn't mind. I was relieved that we could aid one another after a lengthy period of quiet. I asked him if this was what he wanted, leaving out the fact that it was also what I wanted. "Yes, Mom," he responded. "I'm not sure whether it's the proper thing to do, but it's great. I really enjoyed it," which was a comfort for me. Obviously, I felt the same way, so I asked, "Perhaps this is our answer, and we should do it more often to assist one another out. What are your thoughts?" "Yes, indeed. I believe that's a fantastic concept," he responded. "It happened faster than I expected, but we must ensure that Adam is not aware of this." "Okay," I added on. He nodded, and I turned back to kiss him on the forehead again, already anticipating the next time. The remainder of the night went peacefully, but the space between us seemed to decrease, filled with something unsaid. Whatever had happened between us, none of us was ready to acknowledge it. We weren't ready to identify it and tackle it yet, but as the hours passed, we eventually withdrew to our own rooms for the night. I couldn't escape the notion that we were on the verge of something unknown, terrible, but reassuring. At the same time, it was evident that Oliver and I were becoming closer in ways that none of us could describe. And although we both tried to act as if everything was normal, we both knew that nothing would ever be the same. The days that followed appeared to flow with a peaceful cadence, as if Oliver and I had an unsaid agreement that we were seeking something from one another. Even though neither of us could put it into words, we didn't have to. Sometimes words were insufficient to explain what we were both experiencing, which we had always sensed, but were only now starting to comprehend. It was more than merely filling the emptiness created by Sarah's passing. It was about finding comfort in each other's company, in a world that often seemed too huge and too empty. It began with something basic, even mundane, a lengthy drive out into the countryside. I had always liked driving since it provided me the opportunity to think without interruptions. It was something I used to do with Sarah before things became messy, but this time, I found myself giving it to Oliver, as if fleeing the constraints of the home and the weight of our thoughts would allow us both to breathe a little better. "Hey," I stated one day, as I stood in the doorway of Oliver's room. He was seated at his desk, his gaze concentrated on the screen of his laptop, but I could see he wasn't focused on what he was doing. He seemed restless. Like me. "You want to go for a drive so the two of us can clear our brains." Oliver looked up, and his eyes lit up in a manner I hadn't seen in weeks. A smile pulled at his lips, but it wasn't the carefree grin he was accustomed to having. This one was flavored with something subtler, quiet eagerness. Perhaps he had been thinking the same thing. "Yes, I would enjoy that," he responded gently. He had a sweet voice, as if he was glad that I proposed it. We did not have a specific destination in mind. There was no real plan, just the desire to drive and leave behind the heaviness that seemed to hang over the house whenever Adam was present, or whenever we allowed ourselves to feel the weight of things unsaid. We slipped into the car without saying anything else, the engine hum filling the space between us. I pulled out of the driveway. I looked at Oliver. He was peering out the window, his profile bathed by the mellow afternoon light, and for a brief time I felt he seemed older than he was, as if the world was bearing a load. He was unsure how to manage you. "Okay?" I asked in a softer voice than I meant. Oliver nodded slowly, keeping his gaze fixed on the passing countryside. "Yeah," he responded gently, assuming I hadn't pushed him. I knew he did not want to chat. Sometimes quiet spoke more than words. So we drove, letting the world around us fade into the background. The music was kept low in the automobile. Oliver created a familiar playlist a few weeks ago. It was a combination of classic rock and new indie songs that seemed to capture the atmosphere we were both in. Quiet, introspective, and a touch lost. We traveled for what seemed like hours, weaving through rural roads. Small villages and farmland spread out like a big sea of green. The further we traveled, the more I felt the strain in my shoulders relax. The act of traveling and having this time to ourselves seemed like a quick getaway, a break from all that had dragged us down, and I could feel the same sensation of relaxation wash over Oliver. We ended ourselves stopping at a little restaurant on the outskirts of a tranquil town, where everything appeared to slow down. It was one of those sights that seemed to have been stuck in time. Old wood flooring, fading booths, and a menu that hadn't been updated in decades. We sat at a corner booth near the window, the neon sign outside throwing a lovely light over the table between us. Except for a few locals who were deep in discussion, the room was almost deserted. Oliver's shoulders had loosened somewhat, and his gaze were no longer as far away. He remained silent, but there was a gentleness about him now, as if he was gradually breaking out of his shell. We ordered our dinner piece by little, and when the waitress delivered it to the table, I couldn't help but note how Oliver plucked at his fries, more concerned with the ritual of eating than the meal itself. He was still deep in contemplation, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel compelled to say anything. I simply left him be. Finally, after a prolonged period of stillness, Oliver began again, his voice tentative. "Mom, can we talk about what happened last night?" Yes. I believe that's what we both needed," I said slowly, my voice heavy with the emotion that had always been, only, below the surface. "It is something that will help us become well." Oliver caught my stare, his eyes probing as if seeking something. In my words, "Yes, but what if Adam finds out? We'll handle it. Do not worry. It is where life wants to lead us." Maybe Oliver's gaze softened, and he offered a little nod, his fingers curling gently around mine. The gesture was harmless, but at that moment, it seemed like a promise, a secret understanding between us that no matter how damaged the world felt, we'd always have one other. We ended our supper in relative silence, with the weight of our discourse hanging in the air like a calm storm. When we left the restaurant, we did not hurry home. Instead, we took another long drive, this time with no destination in mind, just the road, the vehicle, and the sound of Oliver's music filling the gap between us. By the time we got home, the sun had fallen, and the place seemed different, lighter. Somehow, the door closed softly behind us, and for the first time in weeks, I didn't feel the weight of the stillness that typically met us as we stepped through. As we stood in the corridor, our coat was still slung over our shoulders. Oliver looked up at me, his eyes gleaming in the faint light. "Thank you for today," he replied quietly, his voice sounding more secure than it had in the vehicle or at the cafe. "I really needed it." I grinned genuinely, and this time it reached my eyes as well. "But let's take it one step at a time and see if we can assist one other with our loneliness. All right?" And suddenly the world seemed lighter, not because everything was fixed or we had all the answers, but for a few hours, we were able to just be together. The next day, an unexpected invitation to a party arrived from a family. A friend who I had known for years was holding a party to mark the end of summer. At first, I was unsure if Oliver would want to attend. He'd been more introverted than normal, and his social networks had shrunk. But when I gently suggested it, his eyes lit up, and he nodded with a quiet joy I hadn't seen in a long time. "I could need a change of pace," he admitted. That is all it took. So, after some back and forth, we found ourselves preparing for the evening. The night was warm, the air heavy, and the perfume of summer lingered in the wind. We arrived at the home, a vast ranch on the outskirts of town, where the party had already begun to gather momentum. The music was loud, but not in an overpowering sense. Rather, it was a hum you could feel in your bones. Laughter, banter, and the clicking of glasses filled the air. I looked at Oliver as we went up the stairs to the front entrance, his gaze surveying the throng. He seemed on edge, but not in the way he used to. When we went out in public, things were different. He wasn't avoiding anything. Rather, he was absorbing everything and figuring out where he belonged in the crowd. "You're all right?" I asked gently, my voice calm. Oliver nodded, but his look was more bland than I anticipated. "Yeah, just didn't know what to expect." I lightly squeezed his shoulder. "We will stay together. It's just a party." He gave me a short grin, but it didn't reach his eyes. But it was something, a hint that he was making an effort inside. The mood was not what I had envisioned. It was not a crazy and chaotic scene, but rather a relaxed gathering. Several individuals were dancing near the living room, while others sat about the kitchen island conversing, while others lounged by the backyard pool. The home was full with warmth, both from the people and the brilliant light that illuminated the rooms. We got beverages and navigated our way through the mob. I saw how Oliver appeared to settle into his surroundings, soaking in the discussions going on around him. At one point, a familiar song started to play over the speakers, one we had both always enjoyed. It was one of those tunes that tended to come up in our car travels, which Oliver had shared with me on one of our solitary drives. The song seemed to beckon to him before I ever noticed it. Oliver stepped forward, tapping his foot to the rhythm. "Come on, Mom," he responded with a sneer on his face. "Let us dance." I stared, surprised by his quick offer. He wasn't the kind to dance at a party, at least not previously, but something about his tone and the way he looked at me made me believe this was essential. "I'm too old to dance." I was joking, raising an eyebrow. Oliver rolled his eyes and smirked. "I don't care. Let's just do it." Something in his voice made it impossible for me to refuse. The weight of the occasion was obvious, unsaid, but genuine. It wasn't simply about dancing. It was about bridging the gap that had grown between us, about experiencing a moment of freedom with no judgments or expectations, just the music and ourselves. So, I followed him to the floor. The throng surrounding us faded away, and for a short time, all I cared about was the beat of the music and Oliver's grin. He wasn't concerned about what others thought. Neither was I. We simply moved together, absorbed in the simplicity of the moment. The way his motions were comfortable, and the way he smiled when I did a foolish spin, made the whole world seem as if it could stop for us. It wasn't the ideal dance. I fell over my feet once or twice, and I could see Oliver was trying not to laugh too hard at my embarrassment, but it made no difference. It was our dance, a moment we shared among a throng of strangers that seemed uniquely ours. The music eventually slowed, and the throng thinned out. Oliver and I went out to the terrace for a breath of fresh air. "Thanks, Mom. Our hands are still warm from the action of dancing," Oliver said gently, his voice low and full of something. I couldn't quite place it. I needed it. Suddenly, his breath was warm on my face, near enough for me to sense the reluctance in the air. My heart beat so loudly that I knew he could hear it, yet I couldn't move. Then his lips brushed across mine, cautious at first, as if he was testing the waters. The tenderness of his touch sent a spark through me, and I knew it. I was leaning toward him, reducing the distance between us. His hand found my cheek, his thumb grazing my skin as the kiss deepened, slow and deliberate, yet electric. With something unspoken, every sensation felt amplified. The taste of him, the heat of his body, the faint pressure of his hand steadying me, and in that moment, nothing else existed but us. I remarked, perched on the edge of the patio chair and looking at him. I needed it too. Oliver gazed up at me with a sweet face. He hadn't spoken much all night, but the way he looked at me now told me he knew there was no space between us. It was as if, in the midst of all the commotion and bustle, we had discovered a little private realm in which nothing else mattered. "I'm delighted you came, Mom," he continued, his voice softer than usual. "I would not have missed it for anything," I responded, smiling back. It was not ideal, it was not easy, but as I looked at Oliver, something in his eyes reminded me of why we were doing this, to discover those moments, to make memories, and to show him that, despite everything, we were still here for each other, which was enough.